Hello, I'm Susan Caljean. Thank you so much for your interest in the Boatneck Talk. I'd like to walk you through just what you need to know in order to make your own version successfully. So here's the pattern, and only 4 pattern pieces. There's the front with these 2 French darts. There's the back with a vertical shaping dart. There's no neck dart. That's because it's cut low enough in the back that you don't really need it. If there were one, it would be so short. If you feel you need one, you can add that. There's also a cap sleeve, and there's a long sleeve, and that has a fitting dart right at the top of the sleeve, and of course that sleeve can be short or 3/4 length or long. There's also an elbow dart in there that you don't see marked on this pattern. And this comes in quite a range of sizes, 4 to 24. And if we look on the back, we've got a size chart, and these are taken from the finished garment. And here it tells you what pieces you need, but that's pretty self-explanatory. So one thing I want to point out about the pattern tissue, and it's marked here, but you really need to bear it in mind, there are no seam allowances on this pattern. So if you see a line, that's a stitching line, that's a seam line or a hem line or a neckline. So when you make your own version, use whatever seam allowance you like. Now, I always make a muslin. That's, I think, the way to go. And it's not a bad idea for this pattern because the fitting challenge in it is those French darts. And let me show you. I've got a piece of muslin pinned up here. Just kind of took a piece and I'm pretending it's the front of this. So the first thing to bear in mind when you fit this blouse, it's very common to get a bit of a gape there in the front, almost a dart forming. There's nothing you can do with that except shift that fullness elsewhere. You can't pin it out, you can't fold it out. It has to go into those darts. You'll see that in just a second. So it's very important when you're fitting this, undo those shoulder seams and spread your fabric across, and any extra, that bit from the front, needs to come down and shift into these darts. Now, so what I think is going to give you success, and maybe the darts that are marked on the pattern are going to fit you perfectly. We'll hope that they do. But in case they don't, here's what you do. Spread this across, smooth it, pin your shoulder seam, and I've made little notches here so that the fabric contours around the arm side. And I've pinned the bottom of this straight. You want that to be on grain. And what you're left with, let me just unpin this, what you're left with is the fabric, that extra, which is going to go into those 2 darts. Now, if you wanted to, you could do a single dart, I suppose, but it would be a pretty big dart and it would be very difficult to end it softly. So it's better to break it into 2 darts. So just play around with it patiently until they fall the way you want them to fall. And you want them to be pretty even. Now, I suppose if you wanted to, you could do 3 darts. You could even, if you really wanted to, depends on your shape, how you want this to fit. You might also consider a little bit of a shallow underbust dart. Just a thought. Anyway, take your time and play around with those French darts. They're very, very pretty. They're really lovely. I think they're the main design feature of this blouse. So be patient as you decide just where they need to go. And honestly, they almost form themselves. You'll have the fullness of the bust, and then you're left with the rest of it, and you shape that nicely. All right. So I've got 2 versions put together here I'd like to show you. Obviously, this is with the cap sleeve, and the pattern is marked. There are little notches that show you where that cap sleeve fits in. Now this one, if we look inside, I did 3 rows of gathering there at the top of the cap. I think that's a good idea. Sometimes if you're not happy with how that goes in, you can make a little bit of a dart to give you a bit of a contour, but I was able to get that in there just fine. So this blouse has facings, and let me turn this inside out to show you. Now, the facings don't come on the pattern, but honestly, they're the easiest things in the world to make. You just follow the very top of those pattern pieces, and those are your facings, gone down about 2.5 inches. So here's a back facing and a front facing. And I used just some purchased bias binding to finish off the edge of my facing. So I put the shoulder seams of the blouse together, the shoulder seams of the facing together, sewed them together around the top, did some understitching, some nice clipping in there. And then in order to keep my facing in place, I incorporated it here on the arm side when I sewed in my sleeve cap. More of that seam binding there. And of course, I don't have to worry about any finish up here in the upper half of the sleeve, but I do have to finish off the lower half. Well, you could do a bit of bias binding in self fabric if you wanted to, but I decided to use another piece of that binding, so that took care of the under part of that. And more binding down those side seams. And one very important thing I want to point out, when you sew this side seam, don't include the dart pickup in that seam. That's a good tip for all of your sewing, because if you do, it tends to distort things. You get some pulling in there, and you want that dart pickup to be flexible so that you get a really lovely line with your dart. So sew up to it, finish it off, leap over it, start sewing again. So this is all pretty straightforward. I did a couple of little vents down here. But let's look at the back of this blouse. So I wanted a zipper down the back. It's pretty common. But I still needed extra room at the hem. It wasn't enough room to get in and out of the blouse. So here's something you can do. You can sew a zipper, which goes all the way down. Let me unzip this. And then if you extend the zipper beyond the base of the blouse, that gives you more room to open. Instead of just opening to this point, you can open much wider, very easy to get in. And when you put it on, you zip it up, and then you just fold the zipper up and snap it into place. Pretty cool. You can't do this with an invisible zipper. It will develop a weakness at that fold, but you can certainly do it with a regular zipper. So let's just take one more quick look at this. Oh, and I did add, here in my zipper, I did add a little thread bar and a hook up at the top. That's pretty standard. So that's one way to do this blouse. Let's look at another one. Now with this one, I didn't want to have an opening in the back. It's awfully pretty fabric, and I just didn't like the idea of cutting into that design. So let me turn it over. Here's the back. And as I said, I just didn't want to disturb it. So I thought, all right, well, what can we do? We can do a side zipper. All right, so let's have a look at our side zipper. Okay. And usually when we do side zippers, we do a lapped application. And here it is coming up this side. And down to the bottom, I left 1 inch or so at the bottom, so it comes up here. Well, that's fine going up to the very top of our side seam. But if this were closed, it's very difficult to get into a blouse if the zipper stops right there at the underarm. Honestly, you'd have to be a contortionist to get into this thing. Well, you can't extend the zipper, really. It would just feel really uncomfortable having that zipper tape under your arm. But what you can do is put in a little placket, it sounds more complicated than it is. Let's take a look at it. It's just a series of snaps, so an extension here, and this is down into the sleeve seam. And I just left a wide seam allowance, turned it back and stitched it by machine, put some snaps on it, and it matches up with the other side. Again, there's nothing extra was sewn to it. I just kept my seam allowance wide and sewed the matching snaps. And that gives you plenty of room to get in and out of this blouse. You could extend it further if you like. There's no problem with that. I did mention there was an elbow dart. You can just see it here. And of course, when you're fitting your muslin or your garment, you need to probably position that. We took a guess at where it often falls, but it really does want to hit right at the tip of your elbow. So, you can orient that properly. And let's just have another look at some of the finishing on this. Now with this one, I decided to do a binding. It's a self-fabric binding, little bias binding that I put along the top. I stay stitched that edge. Then I put the binding on there and finished it off by hand. Now, you can't get the binding around these corners. You know, a boat neck, you kind of end up with those angles out here on the shoulders. So what you do is you bind the front, you bind the back, and then you sew that shoulder seam. I'm going to open it here so you can see what's going on. And then you simply, well, we do a lot, but I simply folded the raw edges under and you just tack them in place. Let's have a little look inside some of the finishing. You know, it's funny, when I was working on these blouses, we're so used to doing underlinings and linings that cover up a lot of what's going on inside of a garment, and I kept having to remind myself, it's a blouse, keep it gentle, keep it light. So you have a raw edge here at the sleeve that has to be dealt with, and one of the loveliest ways to take care of that, the least obtrusive way of all, is with this gentle little hand overcasting. So it's stitched, the seam allowance is trimmed down, it's a little whip stitch in place. And what else is going on? I put a little bit of hem lace on the bottom. Nothing really very exotic. I did a French seam on the side that doesn't have the zipper. Pretty straightforward techniques, and I think that's about it. I did do, just for fun, this is a 3/4 length sleeve, and I did just a little opening here at the bottom, and there's a little bit of hem lace sewn, which can be secured with some kind of an invisible stitch. So nothing terribly difficult, and it's an awfully pretty blouse. So I think you know what you need to know to put this together. I hope you enjoy making your boat neck top and wearing it.